United States. In 2018, it's the highest year of giving with $428 billion. Foundations were 18% of that total giving at $76 billion. Individuals gave 68%, corporations gave 5%, and bequests totaled 9%. So that's just to frame a little bit around the philanthropy in the United States, where it's coming from, as well as the size of it. As many of you know, there's been an increase in the critique of philanthropies as well as foundations in particular in the last several years. Most prominent, perhaps, being Anand Giridharadas, who wrote Winners Take All. So Rob, could you talk us through the rising criticism of philanthropy and how you've approached those concerns in your book?
Yeah, it's interesting to come talk about philanthropy in my book here at the Aspen Institute, because the book that Carrie just mentioned, Anand Giridharadas's book, Winners Take All, if any of you have read it, it's a rip-roaring polemic. It's a real page-turner. And it starts with his presentation to the Aspen Institute Fellowship to basically call them out on doling out a few goodies charitably while preserving the mountain of money that they make through the background structures that allow wealth creation in the first place, the rising wealth divide. And I think one of the interesting things, if you read Giridharadas's book, is that he has a very powerful critique to offer about philanthropy. A little bit of do-gooding while preserving the background structure is not going to get at the background structure. If you were paying attention to the news recently, you might have seen Eli Broad's op-ed in the New York Times just a couple days ago, which was in some ways like an Anand Giridharadas opinion piece, which was kind of surprising because he said, it's time to stop thinking, Eli Broad said, it's time to stop thinking about philanthropy as a solution to economic inequality. Please tax me more. And Eli Broad called for a wealth tax on the top 1%. That's what's necessary, not philanthropy. So the Giridharadas book, as I say, really is a kind of backward-looking attempt to look at how people who now are philanthropists made their money in the first place. And if there was a background structure that produced the wealth that is somehow itself unjust, or if the person who made the money actually did harmful things in the process of the money making, we shouldn't think that the philanthropy somehow excuses the mess that was done in the money making. And the poster child example for Giridharadas's book since it came out is the Sackler family. So if you think that the Sacklers are possibly criminally liable for some of the things that at least a few of the members of the family are said to have done or alleged to have done at Purdue Pharma with the OxyContin crisis and the addiction and opioid addiction in the United States, who are now also major donors to universities and arts museums, the basic kind of backward-looking Giridharadas line is the philanthropic goodness that happens after you do the harmful stuff in the money-making doesn't cancel each other out. You don't get to launder your reputation philanthropically to undo the bad stuff you did as a capitalist or a moneymaker. I'll summarize and finish with the Giridharadas thing and then say how I think my book is different, just by giving what is my own example of this, which is a philosopher's example. My own training is as a philosopher. I think the simple way to understand what Anand Giridharadas wants anyone else to understand is that if I go out here in the audience and I find one of you with a very nice watch, and I steal your watch, and I go down to the pawn shop in Aspen, and I sell it for $500, and I take the $500 from your stolen watch, and I give it to a super effective charity that next week improves the lives of a whole bunch of kids or people somewhere else, and then you come to me, and you say, dude, you stole my watch. And I say, but look at the good that it has produced in the world. All the beneficiaries from the money from your watch, it's made the world a better place. Your response is not going to be, oh, well, then we're cool. And that's the point that I think Giridharadas makes. If you did something that was wrong or benefited from injustice in the money-making, philanthropy doesn't somehow excuse that initial act. Now, my book, Just Giving, by contrast, doesn't presume anything negative about the money-making. I like to think of my book as a kind of forward-looking examination of philanthropy. Let's assume, I suggest at the start, that the mountain of money or the modest amounts of money that anyone has as a charitable donor was acquired legitimately. And now we should try to think about what kind of things do philanthropists do in America and elsewhere that interact with expectations about democracy. And if I can, just because you care a lot about education, I care a lot about education, I was a 6th grade teacher, I'll just share the story about how I came into writing the book, which I hope will resonate with many of you. Many of the room, I'm sure, have children. I had spent the first 10 years of my life writing basically scholarship about education. And then I had my own children, and I sent my oldest born kid off to the public school system in Palo Alto. And on the very first day that he was enrolled in the Palo Alto school system, he came home with a whole package of materials, registration forms, et cetera, pretty garden variety stuff, welcome to the district, extraordinary education, and a form that said, the state's education finance system provides us with not enough money to provide the education that we want. And so for every single parent in Palo Alto, there's an expected but voluntary contribution of $2,000 per child. As a parent, I kind of fell off of my chair. Like, I couldn't believe they were asking me to give $2,000 for each kid that I sent to the public school. And I put my scholar hat back on, and I thought, well, what's the likely effect of philanthropic giving to public schools? It's not rocket science here. Wealthy suburban places like Palo Alto or Aspen can raise way more private funds to supplement the public school budget than can poor places like East Palo Alto or San Jose or Oakland or San Francisco. I collected a bunch of data, found exactly that. And so I said, well, here's an example of charitable giving. Some of the stats that Carrie just suggested at the beginning of the opening, where we have charity that is worsening inequality. Here's an example of Palo Alto parents thinking they're doing something noble. And in certain respects, they are. They're supporting the public school system. But they're also supporting their home values. And they're also supporting their own kids' education. Good things, but this is not what I thought charity was supposed to be, assistance to the poor. This was rich people primarily giving to other rich people or their own rich kids, their own relatively wealthy kids. And I then learned something else, which then set me off on the book, which was the Palo Alto School Foundation is a 501c3 public charity registered by the IRS. So Palo Alto parents got tax deductions for giving to the Palo Alto public school system. The federal government, which is to say all of us, are collectively subsidizing the worsening of inequalities in school opportunity by allowing private school foundations to supplement mainly in wealthy places the educational opportunities for mainly wealthy kids.
So hold on just a second.
Yeah.
Now, can you explain how all taxpayers then are subsidizing that?
Yeah, so when you make a charitable contribution, and if you itemize it and you deduct it on your taxes and your annual tax payment, for anyone who's paid taxes, you know how this works. But if those of you in the room who are younger haven't paid taxes, let's just walk through the examples to get right at your question. Let's say that, Carrie, you make a $1,000 contribution to, we'll call it the soup kitchen here in somewhere in Colorado. I make a $1,000 contribution to the same soup kitchen. You and I are producing the identical social value. Same amount of money, same organization. You're wealthier than I am, so you're in a top tax bracket. Let's say it's 40%. You make the $1,000 contribution. It costs you $600 to make that contribution, and $400 is reduced from your tax burden. Money that, if there was no tax incentive, would have been in the Treasury, which is to say all citizens would have benefited to some degree from it. One of the other peculiarities here, this is the contrast between me and Carrie, let's say I'm in the 25% tax bracket. I make the $1,000 contribution to the same organization. It costs me $750 to make the contribution, and $250 is reduced from my taxes. So we have this tax deduction mechanism in the United States, which gives a much greater benefit to the wealthy, and actually means that the rest of the population is diminishing the amount of benefit it would receive from a dollar going into the Treasury. And that's what I mean by it's being collectively subsidized.
Okay.
Let me tell one more story just to bring this all home.
I just wanted to clarify on that.
Yeah.
Please.
This is in the book. I'm not sure where this is true, but it illustrates the point even if it's not true. An investigative journalist was hanging out with George Soros when he created the Open Society sort of suite of philanthropic entities that now and still exist. And Soros did what most philanthropists do when they set up a foundation. They hire a staff and they make some internal deliberations what the program areas are going to be. And then they go public and they invite people to apply for grants. And it was at the tail end of the planning process. They're just about to launch and go public. And there was some disagreement in the room of people about what the final program areas would be. And Soros is alleged to have pounded his fist on the table and said, God damn it, at the end of the day, this is my money, so we're going to do this my way. And the junior program officer whom he'd hired raised his hand and said, actually, Mr. Soros, about 40% of the money here in the foundation would have been in the US Treasury if you hadn't put it here, so I think that other people should have a say too.
And how did
he was fired the next week.
Well, and I think that perspective is also at the crux of some of these questions,
right.
and a lot of the controversy and discussion, which I think is very helpful. And you've addressed some of it in your book around how it, and I'll say also on Palo Alto Unified and school foundations in general, they are separate from the school district. So they are, they're parallel organizations that are for the benefit of the public school district, but they are 501c3s that are separate.
Right.
And it is controversial, as you had said. I spend a lot of time in public education, and parents in LA Unified are not able to do that. And so you do end up with a growing inequality in terms of how dollars are shared. So could you walk us through the points of your book and the main areas of what do we need to do in policy? How do we change tax policy?
Yeah.
Do we change public policy?
Yeah.
Do we have areas where it's disallowed for philanthropic support? And then I want to get into foundations versus other philanthropic donors largely whom are individuals in the United States.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm a philosopher by training, and so I'm not in the business of offering moral advice to donors. I'm a political philosopher, so I'm examining the policies that structure philanthropy. One of the basic sort of assumptions of the book, which I don't think is controversial at all, is that the impulse to give money away to other people is a universal and time immemorial impulse. You can find evidence of charity being practiced in every society across all of history. What makes the charitable or philanthropic sector different in different places are the different policies that kind of structure and give incentives and disincentives to that universal human impulse. So my book really tries to examine the set of public policies that structure charity and philanthropy in the United States, like the tax incentives, like the various rules that attach to private foundations, like the idea, for example, that private foundations, when they're created, the default arrangement is that they exist in perpetuity. So the book examines a whole variety of those things. And I divide up the book's analysis into basically two simple parts. There's looking at the ordinary charitable giving that people make in any given year. Almost 90 to 95% of every single person in the United States makes some charitable contribution every single year. So this is, as I say, basically a universal phenomenon. And where did 501c3 come from? How did we get to that place? Why are there tax deductions for giving? How did we choose between 501c3 and 501c4? Where did private foundations come from? So that was this experience of Palo Alto being asked to give. And then, no, my project now is no longer just about this little thing of private giving to public schools, but where did the whole structure come from? And is it worth having in the form we have it? There's a big criticism I make in the book of a lot of ordinary giving, again, not of individuals, but you'll find if your expectation is, right now in this room, that the bulk of American charitable giving, the $400+ billion that Carrie described, goes to poverty alleviation or fighting disadvantage, you are going to be sorely disappointed. If you make the most maximally generous assumptions about where American charity goes, meaning some of it goes to Stanford, and Stanford, some of the philanthropy goes to support the wonderful palm trees on campus, not especially a redistributive or sort of poverty alleviating phenomenon, but some of it goes to support financial aid for kids who are poor. So that's when I say, if you make the maximally generous assumptions that even art museums or wealthy universities, some of the money given to those places helps kids who are poor, you get to 30% of all giving. And the slightly, at least to my mind, even more surprising fact about the distribution of charitable dollars is that the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to give to help the poor. People who give money to help poor people tend themselves to be relatively poor. People who are wealthy tend to give places like Stanford or art museums. And some of those things can be redistributive or help for poverty alleviation or combat disadvantage, but a whole lot of it isn't. Okay, so there's an examination in the book of that kind of material. And then I turn to private foundations and try to examine the role of big philanthropy, not the role of ordinary giving. Is that where you want to go next?
Well, just a quick point on that. So you're saying the wealthier the individual, the more likely they are not to give. And is that outside of foundations?
Yeah, outside
of foundations. Are you
saying
outside of foundations?
Outside of foundations.
And do you include like DAF's, direct donor advised funds, within that, or is it not? Because there are a number of individuals who end up philanthropically using DAFs in order to direct nonprofit and philanthropic giving.
Right.
And I would argue that a number of those actually are toward some poverty alleviation, maybe not at the same rates, but then getting into foundations, I think that becomes more of a focus from my experience.
Right.
But I will let you move on to foundations, and we just have a few minutes to touch on that, and one more question that I have, and then we'll move into questions.
I'll be really quick. We could get really wonky and talk about DAFs, the short version, DAFs, donor advised funds. I'm not a big fan. We could talk about ordinary giving and the tax incentives. I'm not a big fan of the current tax incentives. Go to big foundations. For me, this forward-looking criticism, so here's the simple way of expressing my reservations about the role that philanthropy plays within democracy. Big philanthropy is, by definition, an activity of people who are wealthy. You can't be a big philanthropist unless you have a lot of money. It's the conversion or the direction of private assets to some public-facing influence. And in that respect, it's a plutocratic element in a democratic setting. And what's even stranger to my point of view, this is the basic criticism, and I want to give you this framework for a redemption, the way that policy has created foundations in the United States has made them what I think of as the most eccentric or idiosyncratic organizational forms or corporate forms we have in the United States. Why? Because they're almost entirely unaccountable. Donors can do whatever they want within a foundation, short of breaking the laws, but you can't vote the philanthropist out of office. You can't decide to find a way that, we talk about competition in the marketplace. There's no real competition in the philanthropic marketplace. The Walton Family Foundation can't put the Gates Foundation out of business. Foundations don't have consumers in the same way that marketplace firms have, in the sense of the consumer can decide to stop buying what the company has on offer. People can't decide to stop buying what the Walton Family Foundation or the Gates Foundation has on offer. People are basically kind of deferential to the donor because you're trying to get money from them, not decide whether to purchase something from them. So it's low accountability. Laws about foundations require almost zero transparency. And so I discovered in the course of doing the research for the book that there are more than 100,000 foundations in the United States. Only 10% of them have a website. The only requirement of a foundation is to publish a 990 tax form, which gives a little bit of information about the people who work there, the investment performance of the endowment, like some of the grants that are made. But if you're a nonprofit organization seeking to raise money with the low transparency expectations, you might not even know that a foundation existed in your backyard, much less know how to apply for a grant from it. Then there's donor direction. Donor's will is what governs the foundation. The expectation that foundations will exist forever. Perpetuity is a long time horizon. Tax lawyers have a line about this where the dead hand of the donor reaches out of the grave to strangle the preferences of all future generations. Even on an assumption that you were meant to be like super strategic and wise and effective as a donor in a foundation, why would you think that what you were committed to when you were a donor still alive would be super effective 100 years from now? Very strange assumption, it seems to me. And then the final thing is that they're lavishly tax advantaged. I discovered, for example, that there's $40 billion in the Gates Foundation. About $15 to $20 billion would have been in the Treasury if there hadn't been the tax advantages that attach to foundations right now. Okay, the sum total of this, philanthropy is an exercise of power, by definition by the wealthy, and it's an attempt to use private assets to have some public influence. I then try to redeem a certain type of operation by explaining why I think policy should change. Perpetuity should go away. I think foundations should be spend-out foundations. Foundations should spend out their money within 20 or 40, pick a number, 50 years after the death of the donors. There should be different tax laws, so the ways that the tax laws now currently over-advantage the wealthy in the way that I described before between Carrie and me. And then there should be expectations that foundations do the following really important thing. They work on a long time horizon to try to solve social problems or stimulate new experiments in social problem solving that you should not expect to find in the for-profit marketplace or in government. And so I describe a justification for foundations in the book that I call discovery. When foundations do things that the marketplace either can't or won't, or that government can't or won't, then foundations can prove to be unbelievably valuable for democracy itself, because for democracy to do well, it has to do well at solving social problems. And in democracies, the public agencies we have are harnessed to short time horizons. If you asked an elected official, would you spend a whole bunch of money for a social experiment where you don't know the outcome of the experiment, and when you find out the outcome, it won't be for 20 years? The official is going to tell you, but I'm up for re-election in 2 or 4 or 6 years. Like, I'm not going to do that. That's what philanthropists have the capacity to do, to take long time horizons. So, last bit here. Okay. I'm sorry, I'll stop. And the last sort of policy lesson here is that there is a kind of mania, I think, these days within foundations and nonprofits to be metric-driven and outcome-oriented and have a strategy. I have no complaint about that. But if that metric-driven outcome or orientation is applied to your grantees as a foundation to a 6-month or a 9-month or a 12-month cycle, here's a bunch of money, dear grantee, and we want the results back in 12 months, well, then you've just systematically undermined the very thing you're distinctively able to do, which is to take an experimental approach over a long time horizon.
So quickly before that, because there are something, you know, we take at the Walton Family Foundation, we take a long time horizon to address these big issues. So the spin down model, though, is actually fairly contradictory to what you're asking philanthropists to think about in terms of having a spin down foundation over a shorter period of time. But if you're addressing these large social issues, that might be a 30 or 40 or 50-year time horizon to have real impact and real structural change, especially if you're looking at issues around inequality and social justice issues. And so there's a contradiction in what you're asking for.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all in favor of long time horizons. That is the take-home message of the book that redeems philanthropy, big philanthropy. Perpetuity is too long, a long time horizon. So I would want to make a clear argument. There's no, like, from the principled arguments I make, you don't get a number. 50 years is the exactly right amount, so we can debate about that. But I'm against perpetuity.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you. I'd like to switch to questions now. And this is being recorded, so we have mics around the room. If you could raise your hand if you have questions. Right over here. Oh, Lori.
Thank you. I may be the only person in the room who was actually in Anand's book. Yes, I do run a foundation, started it. And that has to do with my question. But first of all, I just have one thing you said is that philanthropists can't get voted out. But that's not completely true. Wasn't it the Atlantic Foundation where the board kind of disagreed with everything that the founder wanted to do? So they didn't vote him out, but they kind of voted his power out, as I remember. Is that?
You may know the detail better than I do.
Which might be why I don't have a board of directors, but no, I do.
I would say in many
I actually do. I was kidding. I do have a board. I was kidding. So Anand was fairly gentle with me, and I agree. I actually agree with a lot of what he says. But your point about, you know, Eli Broad and Ray Dalio was on 60 Minutes on his 150-foot yacht saying that the wealthy aren't paying enough, et cetera. And the one place, and I've thought about a lot where Anand was not so gentle on me, is that, and I said the same thing, that we should be paying more taxes. And he said, and he asked me, I read it a while ago and tucked it away, but he asked me, or he says in the book, but was I prepared to go to Washington to change the laws? And he quotes me as either not answering or staying silent, and he's right. I don't disagree with him, but I wonder, but I haven't taken public stances like George Soros has, like Buffett has, like Ray Dalio has, like Eli Broad has. And do you find it a little bit hypocritical that they're taking these stances, my guess is they have lawyers and accountants and people working on them not paying higher taxes. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they're taking these public stances, but it's not against the law to pay higher taxes.
Right.
you
yes.
know, they could be paying, we all could be paying higher taxes and get rid of the lawyers and the foundations.
Sure.
So I have some problems with the public stances.
I don't know any of the details about the people who are calling for higher taxes and whether there are lawyers doing something different in the background. I guess what I would say, the important lesson in my head is that you can try to change things as a donor and you can try to change things as a citizen. And you shouldn't imagine that the two things are the same thing. So take the initial example of giving money to your own kids' public schools. When I would ask my friends in Palo Alto, why are we doing this, $2,000 per kid? They'd say, it's because in Sacramento, the school finance system is totally broken. I say, well, what's the giving to Palo Alto doing about that problem? You're solving the problem at a hyper-local level in a way that you can, and leaving the entire root cause untouched. And going off to Sacramento to change the school finance system would be to act as a citizen. And the people in Palo Alto are probably the savviest political actors around. And they chose to solve the problem primarily as donors. That's the mistake.
Let me ask another.
That's not answering my question. Why, if they're so against the wealthy not paying higher taxes, why aren't they paying higher taxes?
You mean voluntarily paying higher taxes?
Not finding ways not to pay higher taxes.
I don't know if they are.
Yeah.
And no, I don't either,
I don't
but
know.
my guess is people
Right.
could be actually paying higher taxes.
All right. Well, let me ask a tax code question.
Yeah.
So would you recommend then, because you talked before about the differential of tax treatment that the two of us receive
Right.
in that same $1,000 gift, is your recommendation, what is your recommendation on tax code then in changing in terms of the benefit?
Right. So the recommendation I make is that instead of this tax deduction structure, which amplifies the voices of the wealthy in the policy mechanism itself, I think we should have a flat and non-refundable charitable tax credit. So when you make the $1,000 contribution and I make the $1,000 contribution, let's imagine that there's a $500 tax credit for every single person. It costs you $500 and you deduct $500 or your taxes are lowered by $500. Right. Same thing happens for me. And that after your tax credit is exhausted, you still have the freedom to give money away, but no longer in a tax incentivized way.
Got it. Other questions? Let's go right back here. Yes, I think right here. Yes.
I was that far back. So I think broadly one of my questions is sort of going to the point that philanthropy is not designed to deliver the liberation for which many of the philanthropic programs seek. Yep. Right? It just isn't. Right. So when we think about what is the point of philanthropy, more so than just the idea of saying how do you advocate for public policy, I think one of the real questions is how do we think about the role of philanthropy in building and constructing a civil society that is able to do that work that philanthropy is actually definitionally barred from. Mm-hmm. And I think institutional philanthropy is probably better suited, I think, for many of the reasons I think that were elucidated in the first question, better positioned to have a more consistent and principled approach over time. Mm-hmm. But it is sort of, I do have a question when you say it undermines democracy. You've got these sort of taxation and policy questions, right. But then there's the work of philanthropy Correct. Itself. Yep. And how does philanthropy actually enter and actually tend to reform and change systems? Right. Caveat, I do work for a private family foundation, so I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. Well, I think you've described it really well. I want to try to argue at the end of the day that there is a way that philanthropy can support rather than subvert democracy. And the argument is that when philanthropy operates over an experimental, long-time horizon social problem-solving approach, and it humbly presents the evidence-based successes, oftentimes to the government to scale up for all people, it's doing something that's hugely beneficial to democracy. When philanthropy acts to preserve the background privilege of the people who say they're being donors, but are doing something that actually leaves the root cause untouched, the private giving to the public schools in Palo Alto, it's more of the Anand Giridharadas feel-good exercise, in this particular case, which heaps advantage onto advantage rather than redressing disadvantage. And in that respect, it undermines democracy with this peculiar social good apparatus. I mean, another basic lesson in my book, I want to say, is that when big philanthropists exercise power, which is to say what anybody does in a big foundation, the response that all of us should have to a big philanthropist is not automatic gratitude, thank you for donating, but rather to scrutinize the power to see whether it's doing something beneficial for democracy rather than at odds with it.
Because I think both you and Anand have done this. You have conflated individual givers with institutional philanthropy, which actually has, I think, much broader rails on it. Some of it just from institutional hiring, all the way down to like what you can and cannot do with this money, which is fundamentally different than necessarily. And yes, you have trustees and actors and things who will intervene in ways that are sometimes disappointing, but there is, to me, a meaningful distinction between the kinds of individual donors, whether you're talking just $2,000 or $200 million, and how that enters the space, and the distinction between that and institutional philanthropy. And when you say philanthropist as if they're all the same, I think conflates the ideas and limits solutions because we're not examining the full panoply of tools.
Yep, that's fair. Thank you.
Just right on the other side here. Thank you.
Question for you. You talked about the impact of giving to programs that really help the disadvantaged versus giving to the art museum or Stanford that may help the more affluent. Do you have any recommendations, or have you seen any models that incent greater giving to the disadvantaged programs than the affluent programs?
Yeah, again, my focus is on public policy. So I think there are easily imaginable public policies that could provide an incentive of exactly the sort you have in mind. So for example, imagine that instead of this universal tax incentive you give to an arts museum, Stanford University, the Aspen Institute, the Palo Alto School Foundation, the Soup Kitchen, you get the same tax incentive no matter what the organization you give to, as long as it's a 501c3 public charity. In the United States, we have the most inclusive, kaleidoscopic 501c3 sector of any country. Imagine the tax incentive said, if you give to an organization whose beneficiaries or clientele were 50% people who were in poverty, then you qualify for a double tax incentive, let's say. So that if you were a private donor to a public school, if the school had 50% plus kids on free and reduced lunch, then you get a big tax incentive to give there. But if you get to Palo Alto, you get none. That seems to me a reasonable way to approach an incentive structure that puts the thumb on the scale of kids who are poor.
Next question. Let's go right over here.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts about...
We're recording right now. Let's go ahead and let's go to you first, and then we'll come back to you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
And I never play by the rules. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about community foundations. You inferred that you have some concerns about donor advised funds, which oftentimes is a chunk of the assets of community foundations.
Right.
But I'd be curious to know what impact, if any, you see them playing in the inequity issues that our country is still dealing with.
Yeah, a quick answer. So first, I don't have a direct answer to whether community foundations have played a really powerful role in confronting inequity. Not because I think there is no answer, because I haven't studied that. However, one of the interesting things about community foundations from my point of view is that there's a different tax incentive structure, different policy structure for community foundations than a private family foundation. There's a larger tax benefit for giving money as an individual to a community foundation, because you partly give up some governance control when you give money to a community foundation. Community foundations, by law, have to be governed by community representatives. So if you put money into a private family foundation, you retain the control yourself, and therefore there's a smaller tax benefit than you would get by putting a community foundation. Donor advised funds, when our neck of the woods, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation pioneered the conversion of a community trust model, community foundation model, into a mountain of individual donor advised funds. I think donor advised funds are a problem because they're a warehouse for wealth. Donor advised fund itself counts as a 501c3 public charity, but hasn't produced anything. It's an investment account for your charity. And the incentive structure for the place that has it, the community foundation or the Fidelities and Vanguards of the world, is to keep the money under management because they get investment fees off of it. Their incentive structure as the manager of your donor-advised fund is to keep your money in the warehouse because they make more money off of it. And they make almost no reporting of it. They report in the aggregate money that goes out for donor-advised funds, but not fund by fund by fund. And there's no annual payout requirement for a donor-advised fund. It's a place for people to stuff a bunch of money and not make any decisions while taking the full tax benefit by stuffing it in the warehouse.
Let's go. Yes.
Great conversation. So a question for both of you. Can you address the issue of overhead and the restrictions that foundations often place on overhead that nonprofits are trying to pay their costs? Some foundations won't pay any overhead. Some are restrict the amount that a grant, for example, will pay to a nonprofit to execute some of the programs that are being funded. It's a challenge across the board, I think, for nonprofits.
Right.
You want to take that one?
I think that's more for me.
Yeah.
So foundations vary in terms of in their grants and in their grant making, whether or not they, or how much and to what degree they will focus and pay for overhead. And it really depends. It's one of those things that it varies so much within the foundation and how they do grant making. One of the things we've been talking about internally at the Walton Family Foundation is we've been looking at our next 5-year strategic planning process is this question of what does Philanthropy 2.0 look like and how does grant making change? Should it be changing and in what ways does it change so that there is greater partnership? We didn't get into the issue around the inequality of power. When you have a foundation and a grantee and then from the grantee and the nonprofit to the community in which they're working. And so you have power, you have unequal power distributed throughout those, and it's really important from our perspective to make sure that we're thoughtful and caring and thinking about that because there's a responsibility that comes with that to make sure that you're minimizing the differences there. But as it goes to overhead, it varies by every foundation and grant making. Next, Jillian.
So are you suggesting that, for example, the Ford Foundation be finished, close its doors?
I think private foundations should have an expiration date. That's right. And interestingly, my book starts with a story about the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations were created in the early 1900s. Before there were any tax incentives to give money away. Tax incentives only exist once there's an income tax, and income taxes date back to 1917. And so the Carnegie and Rockefeller created before then. And Rockefeller went off to the US Congress in order to ask Congress to pass a bill that chartered the existence of a Rockefeller Foundation. And Congress basically said no on a number of occasions, even though he was offering to give all this money away. That story is told in the opening pages of the book. And Rockefeller came back with a compromise. He said, how about I put the money there and I spend it out within 50 years? It's not a perpetual philanthropy. Congress ended up saying no to that too. He also proposed that the governance of the Rockefeller Foundation be shared, it would be communal. He eventually got fed up with Congress. And he went back to New York State, where he had partly greased the wheels of the New York State legislature and created a perpetual foundation with family governance of the Rockefeller Foundation. So the short answer is yes, I think that we should expect that in the future, there will also be wealthy people who will also create foundations. And there are plenty of problems to be worked on now. And foundations should not accumulate over time so that we have more and more and more foundations existing in perpetuity trying to solve various problems. Spend your money over a long time horizon, but not one that's perpetual.
Great. One more question back here. Yep, with your hand up. Great. And this is our last question.
Thanks so much. One question I had, I really appreciated the framework you had about thinking about what makes philanthropy just, long-term horizons. But one question I've been wrestling with is philanthropy obviously shapes the way we think about the world. So Nick Hanauer had that great article in The Atlantic a couple weeks ago about the disproportionate emphasis on education as a solution to inequality. So foundations fund think tanks, they fund academics, they plow a lot of money into education, sometimes at the expense of focusing on broader things like worker power, unionization, labor market policy, wage stagnation, et cetera. So I kind of worry about the distortion of what our attention is put on, because education is kind of a it's almost like an easy thing, right? Like everyone loves education. Education is very important. So how do I fix that? How do I make that just in your framework?
Yeah.
The way to which philanthropy shapes the way we think about the world.
Yeah. So my answer might be a bit of a surprise, but I really feel this strongly. When you have as minimal accountability as a foundation has, or as a program officer has at a foundation, then have the courage of your convictions and the permission to have an idiosyncratic take on hard problems. And don't be risk averse. Actually try to do something that might be unpopular. Because as I said, there's no one who can put the foundation out of business, and there's no one who's going to get unelected. So you've got permission to take a long time horizon view. I make a brief analogy in the book. This is what I've been writing recently. We'll see if this lands with any of you as a helpful way to think about this. Sometimes when I go to talk to people who have a lot of money and they're giving money away, I'll say that I have this really bizarre institutional privilege at Stanford. I'm tenured. I have lifetime job unaccountability. No one holds me to account for anything I do except if I break the law. Most people think that's preposterous, recipe for laziness and unaccountability and low productivity. If tenure is good for something, it might be good for letting people who exist in universities try 10-year-long projects where the outcome is totally uncertain. But maybe you get something that is a new truth, a brand new innovation. You create new knowledge. That wouldn't happen if you were on the payroll in a for-profit company or in a public agency. And if what tenured scholars do is really small, cautious, incremental additions to knowledge. I write a book review once a year. I make a small little commentary over there. If you put me on a 5-year renewable contract on some productivity metric, everything about the world is the same. If I'm going to have tenure, be bold. Take long time horizon scholarly risks. If you're going to be a philanthropist, don't be short time horizon risk averse. Be bold and take long time horizon social problem solving risks. Have the courage of your convictions. Take advantage of your unaccountability.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.